Chapter 4, An Explosion. At Christmas, Hugh found that things were not so pleasant at home. There was nothing now to take his uncle away from Burnside, and the dullness of the place told upon him. His outbursts of ill temper were therefore more frequent than they had been the last holidays Hugh had spent at home. He sat much longer in the dining room over his wine, after his wife and Hugh had left him, than he did before, and was sometimes moody, sometimes bad-tempered when he joined them. Hugh's own temper occasionally broke out at this, and there were several quarrels between him and his uncle, but there was a savage fierceness in the latter's manner that cowed the boy, and whatever he felt he learned to hold his tongue. But he came more and more to dislike his uncle, especially as he saw that when angry he would turn upon his aunt and speak violently to her in her own language. Sometimes she would blaze out in return, but generally she continued to smoke her cigarette tranquilly, as if utterly unconscious that she was spoken to. So for the next 2 years matters went on. During the summer holidays, Hugh seldom saw his uncle, who was more and more away from home, being now a constant attendant at all the principal racecourses in the country. Even in winter he was often away in London, to Hugh's great satisfaction, for when he was at home there were frequent quarrels between them, and Hugh could see that his uncle habitually drank a great deal more wine than was good for him. Indeed, it was always in the evening that these scenes occurred. At other times his uncle seemed to make an effort to be pleasant with him. In summer, Hugh went away with his aunt for a time, but he spent a part of his holidays at Burnside, for of all exercises he best loved riding. His pony had been given up, but there were plenty of horses in the stables, for although William Tunstall did not care for hunting, he rode a good deal and was an excellent horseman. "What have you got in the stable, James?" Hugh asked one day on his return from the school. "I've got a set of the worst-tempered devils in the country, Master Hugh. Except them 2 ponies that I drives your aunt out with, there isn't a horse in the stables fit for a Christian to ride. They are all good horses, first-rate horses, putting aside their tempers, but your uncle seems to delight in buying creatures that know what else will ride. Of course he gets them cheap. He doesn't care how wicked they are, and he seems to enjoy it when they begin their pranks with him. I thought at first he would get his brains dashed out to a certainty, but I never saw a man keep his seat as he does. He told me once that when a man had been breaking broncos, that is what he called them, which means, he said, wild horses that had never been backed, he could sit anything, and that English horses were like sheep in comparison. Of course it is no use saying no to you, Master Hugh, but if you want to go out you must stick to that big meadow. You must mount there, and you must promise me not to go beyond it. I've been letting the hedges grow there on purpose for the last 2 years, and no horse will try to take them. The ground is pretty soft, and you will fall light. You've been getting on with your riding the last 3 years, and have had some pretty rough mounts, but none as bad as what we have got in the stables now. I shall always go out with you myself with one of the men in case of accident, and I can put you up to some of their tricks before you mount." Hugh was more than 15 now, and was very tall and strong for his age. He had ridden a great deal when he had been at home during the summer, and the winter when the weather was open, and had learned to sit on nasty-tempered animals, for these had gradually taken the place of his father's steady hunters. But this year he found that the coachman's opinion of those now under his charge was by no means exaggerated. In spite of doing his best to keep his seat, he had many heavy falls, being once or twice stunned. But he stuck to it, and by the end of the holidays flattered himself that he could ride the worst-tempered animal in the stable. He did not go away this year, begging his aunt to remain at home. "It is a splendid chance of learning to ride well, Aunt," he said. "If I stick at it right through these 2 months every day, I shall really have got a good seat, and you know it is a lot better my getting chucked off now than if I was older. You see boys' bones ain't set, and they hardly ever break them, and if they do they mend up in no time." His aunt had at very first strongly opposed his riding any of the animals in the stable, and he had been obliged to bring in James to assure her that some of them were not much worse than those he had ridden before, and that a fall on the soft ground of the meadow was not likely to be very serious, but it was only on his giving her his solemn promise that he would not on any account go beyond the meadow that she finally consented. On his return at Christmas he found his uncle at home, and apparently in an unusually pleasant humor. A frost had set in that seemed likely to be a long one, and the ground was as hard as iron. "I hear, Hugh," his uncle said the second morning at breakfast, "that you are becoming a first-rate rider. I am glad to hear it. Out in the Western States every man is a good rider. You may say that he lives on horseback, and it comes natural even to boys to be able to sit barebacked on the first horse that comes to hand. Of course it is not so important here. Still, a man who is a really good rider has many advantages. In the first place, all gentlemen here hunt, and a man who can go across any country and can keep his place in the front rank has much honor among his neighbors. In the second place, he is enabled to get his horses cheap. A horse that will fetch 200 if he is free from vice can be often picked up for 20 if he gets the reputation of being bad-tempered. There is another accomplishment we all have in the West, and that is to be good pistol shots. As we cannot ride, and there is nothing else to do, I will teach you if you like. Hugh accepted the offer with lively satisfaction, heedless of an exclamation of dissent from his aunt. When he had left the room, William Tunstall turned savagely upon his wife. "What did you want to interfere for? Just attend to your own business, or it will be the worst for you." "It is my own business," she said fearlessly. "I like that boy, and I am not going to see him hurt. Ever since you told me, soon after we first came here, that by his father's will the whole property came to you if Hugh died before he came of age, I have been anxious for him. I don't want to interfere with your way of going on. Lead your own life. Squander your share of the property if you like. It is nothing to me. When it is spent, I am ready to go back to our old life, but I won't have the boy hurt. I have always accepted your story as to how you became possessed of the papers without question. I know you have killed a score of men in what you call a fair fight, but I did not know that you were a murderer in cold blood. Anyhow, the boy shan't be hurt. I believe you bought those horses knowing that he would try them, and believing they would break his neck. They haven't, but no thanks to you. Now you have offered to teach him pistol shooting. It is so easy for an accident to take place, isn't it? But I warn you that if anything happens to him, I will go straight to the nearest magistrate and tell him who you really are, and that I am certain there was no accident but a murder." The man was white with fury and advanced a step toward her. "Have you gone mad?" he asked between his teeth. "By heavens—" "No, you won't," she interrupted. "Don't make the threat, because I might not forgive you if you did. Do you think I'm afraid of you? You are not in California or Mexico now. People cannot be shot here without inquiry. I know what you were thinking of. An accident might happen to me, too. I know that any love you ever had for me has died out long ago, but I hold to my life. I have placed in safe hands, never mind where I have placed it, a paper telling all the truth. It is to be opened if I die suddenly and without sending for it. In it I say that if my death is said to have been caused by an accident, it would be no accident but murder, and that if I die suddenly without visible cause, that I shall have been poisoned. Do you think I don't know you, and that knowing you I would trust my life altogether in your hands? There, that is enough. We need not threaten each other. I know you, and you know me. We will both go our own way." And she walked out of the room, leaving her husband speechless with fury at this open and unexpected revolt. Half an hour later his dog-cart was at the door, and he left for London. Hugh was astonished when, on his return from a walk down to Gowan's cottage, he found that his uncle had gone up to town. "Why, I thought, aunt, he was going to be at home all the holidays, and he said that he was going to teach me pistol shooting." "Your uncle often changes his mind suddenly. I will teach you pistol shooting, Hugh. Most Mexican women can use a pistol in case of need. I cannot shoot as he does, but I can teach you to shoot fairly, and after that it is merely a matter of incessant practice. If you ever travel, I dare say you will find it very useful to be able to use a pistol cleverly. There are 2 or 3 revolvers upstairs and plenty of ammunition, so if you like we will practice in the conservatory. It is too cold to go out. You had better go and ask James to give you some thick planks, 5 or 6 of them, to set up as targets. If he has got such a thing as an iron plate, it will be better still. I don't want to spoil my picture. The place is 40 feet long, which will be a long enough range to begin with." Half an hour later the sharp cracks of a revolver rang out in the conservatory, and from that time to the end of the holidays Hugh practiced for 2 or 3 hours a day, the carrier bringing over fresh supplies of ammunition twice a week. He found at first that the sharp recoil of the revolver rendered it very difficult for him to shoot straight, but in time he became accustomed to this, and at the end of a fortnight could put every shot in or close to the spot he had marked as a bull's-eye. After the first day his aunt laid aside her pistol and betook herself to her favorite hammock, where, sometimes touching her guitar, sometimes glancing at a book, she watched his progress. At the end of the fortnight she said, "You begin to shoot fairly straight. Keep on, Hugh, and with constant practice you will be able to hit a half-crown every time. In the West it is a common thing for a man to hold a copper coin between his finger and thumb for another to shoot at. I have seen it done scores of times, but it will take you some time to get to that. You must remember that there is very seldom time to take a steady, deliberate aim as you do. When a man shoots, he has got to shoot quickly. Now practice standing with your face the other way, and then turn and fire the instant your eye catches the mark. After that, you must practice firing from your hip. Sometimes there is no time to raise the arm. Out in the West, a man has got to do one of two things, either not to carry a revolver at all, or else he must be able to shoot as quickly as a flash of lightning. I don't suppose I am ever going to the West, Aunt. Still, I should like to be able to shoot like that, for if one does a thing at all, one likes to do it well. And so to the end of the holidays, the revolver practice went on steadily every morning, Hugh generally firing 70 or 80 cartridges. He could not do this at first, for the wrench of the recoil strained his wrist, but this gained strength as he went on. Before he went back to school, he himself thought that he was becoming a very fair shot, although his aunt assured him that he had hardly begun to shoot according to Western notions. Mrs. Tunstall had one day, a year before this, driven over to Carlisle and, somewhat to the surprise of Mr. Randolph, had called upon him at his office. "Mr. Randolph," she began, "I do not know anything about English law. I want to ask you a question." "Certainly, my dear madam." "If a married woman was to leave a sealed letter in the hands of a lawyer, could he retain possession of it for her, even if her husband called upon him to give it up?" "It is a nice question, Mrs. Tunstall. If the lawyer was acting as the fiduciary agent of a lady, he would at any rate see that her wishes were complied with. Whether he could absolutely hold the paper against her husband's claim is a point upon which I am not prepared at present to give an answer. But anyhow, there are ways of evading the law. For instance, he could pass it on to a third party, and then, unless the husband had been absolutely informed by his wife that she had handed over this document to him, the husband would be powerless. The lawyer would simply declare that he had no such document. Are you asking for your own sake, Mrs. Tunstall, or in the interest of a friend?" "In my own interest, Mr. Randolph. I have a written paper here. I have not signed it yet, because I believe it is necessary to sign papers in the presence of witnesses." "It depends upon the nature of the paper, Mrs. Tunstall, but in all cases it is a prudent step, for then no question as to the authenticity can arise." "And it is not necessary for the witnesses of the signature to read the contents of the documents?" "By no means. They simply witness the signature." "Well, Mr. Randolph, this is the document I want to leave in safe hands, so that it can be opened after my death, unless I previously request, not by letter, but by word of mouth, that it should be returned to me. I know of no one else to whom I could commit the paper, which is, in my opinion, a very important one. The only question is whether, as you are Mr. Tunstall's solicitor, you would like to take it." "Frankly, without knowing the nature of the contents, Mrs. Tunstall, I should certainly prefer not to undertake such a charge. Should it remain in my hands, or rather in the hands of our firm, for we may sincerely trust that there would be no occasion for opening it until very many years after my death, it might be found to contain instructions which could hardly be carried out by a firm situated as we are with regard to Mr. Tunstall." "I see that, Mr. Randolph." There was a pause, and then the lawyer said, "Will you be going up to town shortly, Mrs. Tunstall?" "Yes, in the course of a month or so I shall be passing through London with Hugh." "Will the matter keep until then?" "Certainly, there is no great hurry about it, but I wish the packet placed in safe hands where it would be opened in the event of my death, unless I recall it before that." "In that case, Mrs. Tunstall, I will give you the address of a firm who do my London business. They are an old established firm of the highest respectability, and the documents will be perfectly safe in their hands until you demand it back, or until they hear of your demise. I will give you a letter of introduction to them." Accordingly, when Mrs. Tunstall went up to town the next time with Hugh, she called upon the firm of solicitors, whose place of business was in Essex Street, and upon reading Mr. Randolph's letter, which stated that she was the wife of one of his clients, a gentleman of means, she was courteously received, and they at once agreed to take charge of any document she might place in their hands, upon the understanding that if she did not write or call for it, it should be opened when they heard of her death, and its contents, whatever they might be, acted upon. "You will stand in the position of our client, Mrs. Tunstall, and we will do all in our power to carry out your wishes as expressed in this document, whatever it may be. It is no unusual matter for a will to be left with us under precisely similar circumstances." "If the packet should be opened under the conditions I name," Mrs. Tunstall said, "you will probably not regret having undertaken its charge, for I can assure you that it may put a considerable amount of business in your hands. But how will you know of my death?" "Mr. Randolph or his successor would inform us. Of course we shall request him to do so." And as soon as he knows of the event, Mrs. Tunstall added, it is of the utmost importance that the paper should be opened as soon as possible after my death. We will request Mr. Randolph to inform us by telegraph immediately he receives the news. But, pardon me, you look well and healthy, and are young to be making such careful provisions for an event that may be far distant. That may or may not be far distant, she said, but for certain important reasons I wish to be prepared for it at all points. I will now sign it in your presence, Mr. Curtis. I have not yet put my signature to it. Very well, Mrs. Tunstall. 2 of my clerks shall witness your signature. It may be many years before any questions as to the authenticity of the signature may arise, so I shall be a witness also. The document was a lengthy one, written on 16 pages of foolscap. 2 of the clerks were called in. Now, if you will turn that last page down, Mrs. Tunstall, so that its contents cannot be seen, you can sign your name and we will witness it. This was done. Now, Mrs. Tunstall, if you will put a sheet of brown paper over the other sheets and place your initials on the margin at the bottom, we will put ours, so that no question can arise as to the whole of them forming part of the document signed by you. Now, madam, if you will fold it up and place it in this envelope, I will attach my seal. I presume you do not carry a seal? No, sir. I think it would be more satisfactory that you should affix a seal of some sort, no matter how common a thing it may be. Mr. Carter, will you go up into the Strand with this lady and take her to some shop where she can purchase a seal? It does not matter what it is, Mrs. Tunstall. Any common thing with a bird or a motto or anything else upon it. These things are not cut in duplicate. Therefore, if you seal the envelope in 2 or 3 places with it and take the seal away with you, it will be a guarantee to you, should you ever require it to be returned, that it has not been opened. In the meantime, I will get a small, strong box similar to those you see round the room, and have your name painted on it. When it is completed, I shall put the envelope in it, lock it up, and place it in our strong room downstairs. The seal was purchased and fixed, and Mrs. Tunstall took her departure, satisfied that she had left the document in safe hands. Mr. Curtis talked the matter over with his partner. The latter laughed. Women love a little mystery, Curtis. I suppose she has got a little property in her own right and does not mean to leave it to her husband, and is afraid he may get hold of her will and find out how she has left it. I don't think it is that, Mr. Curtis said, although of course it may be. I should say she was a foreigner, a Spaniard or Italian. She spoke with a slight accent. Besides, the thing extends over 16 pages of foolscap. That is likely enough if she made the will herself, Curtis. She may have gone into a whole history as to why she has not left her money to her husband. Possibly, but I don't think so. You mark my words, Harris. If that packet ever comes to be opened, there will be some rum disclosures in it. That woman was no fool, and there is no doubt about her being thoroughly in earnest. She said it was likely to give us some work when it was opened, and I believe her. I will write a letter to Randolph and ask him to give us a few particulars about this client he has introduced us to. When he received Mr. Randolph's reply, stating briefly the history of Mr. William Tunstall, the husband of the lady he had introduced to them, Mr. Curtis was more convinced than before that the delivery of this packet into his charge was not a mere freak, and offered to bet his partner a new hat that the document was not merely a will, but that it would turn out something altogether unusual. Mr. Randolph congratulated himself on his forethought when, a year after Mrs. Tunstall's visit, Mr. Tunstall came into the office. I am just on my way up to town, he said. I wish you would let me have a couple of hundred in advance on the next rents. Certainly, Mr. Tunstall. You have already had £200 on them, you know. Yes, I know, but I have been a little unlucky lately and have got an account I want to settle. By the way, he said carelessly, as he placed the banknotes in his pocketbook, Mrs. Tunstall asked me to get from you the letter or packet she left in your charge. A letter, Mr. Tunstall? I think there must be some mistake. Mrs. Tunstall has certainly left nothing whatever in my charge. Oh, I suppose I misunderstood her. I only made up my mind to start a short time before I came off, and did not pay much attention to what she was saying, but it was something about a letter, and she mentioned your name. There were 6 commissions she wanted me to execute for her in London, and I suppose they all got mixed up together. I dare say it is of no consequence one way or the other. Well, thanks for the money. Now I'm off. I am very much afraid that William Tunstall is a liar, Mr. Randolph said to himself thoughtfully after his client had left. He has found out that his wife has entrusted some document or other to someone, and he guessed naturally enough that she had most likely come to me with it, and he played a bold stroke to get it. I do not like the way he has fallen into of spending all his time going about the country to race courses. I don't believe he has been at home 2 months this year. Besides, he sounded me last time he was here about raising a few thousands on a mortgage. He is not turning out well. I thought when he first came back that his wanderings had done him no harm. No doubt I had been prepossessed in his favor by his refusal to accept Edgar's offers to divide the rents with him, but I was too hasty. I am afraid there will be trouble at Burnside. It is very fortunate Edgar put my name in as trustee for his son, so that his share of the property is safe whatever happens to the other. But I hate to see a man of a good old family like the Tunstalls going wrong. I wonder what this mysterious document his wife wanted to leave with me is. It must be something of great importance, or he would never have come to me and lied in order to get it into his hands. It is a queer business. Hugh did not see his uncle when he was at home for the summer holidays. His aunt seemed to take his absence as a matter of course. "Don't you expect Uncle home soon?" he asked her one day. "I never expect him," she said quietly. "I think it is a shame he stays away so, leaving you all by yourself, Aunt," Hugh said indignantly. "I am accustomed to it by this time, Hugh, and upon the whole I think perhaps he is better away than here while you are at home. You see, you do not get on very well together." "Well, Aunt, I am sure I don't want any rows." "I don't say you do, Hugh, but still there are rows. You see he is passionate, and you are passionate, and it is very much better you should be apart. As for me, I have always been accustomed to his being away from me a good deal ever since we married, and it does not trouble me at all. I would much rather have you all to myself. Your being here makes it a very pleasant time for me. We ride together, drive together, and practice shooting together. It is all a change to me, for except when you are here, I seldom stir beyond the gardens." Hugh had indeed no doubt that his aunt was more comfortable when his uncle was away, for he heard from Wilson that when Mr. Tunstall was at home, there were constant quarrels between him and his wife. "He ain't like your father, Mr. Hugh. Ah, he was a gentleman of the right sort. Not that your uncle is a bad master. He is hasty if everything is not quite right, but in general he is pleasant spoken and easy to get on with. He is popular with the gentry, though of late they have held off a bit. I hear it said they don't hold to a gentleman spending all his life on the race courses and leaving his wife by herself. Your aunt is well liked, and would be better liked if she would only go abroad and visit, but she never drives out unless when you are here, and people have given up calling. It is a bad job, but I hope when you come of age, Mr. Hugh, we shall have the old times back again, when the Tunstalls were one of the first families in the county, and took the lead of pretty nigh everything." "Well, they have 5 years to wait for that, Wilson. I am just 16 now, and I mean when I do come of age and am my own master to travel about for a bit before I settle down into a country squire." "Well, I suppose that is natural enough, Mr. Hugh, though why people want to be running off to foreign parts is more than I can make out. Anyway, sir, I hope you won't be bringing a foreign wife back with you." "There is no fear of that," Hugh laughed, "at least according to my present ideas. But I suppose that is a thing no one can settle about until their time comes. At any rate, Aunt is a foreigner, and I am sure no one could be kinder or nicer than she is." "That she is, Mr. Hugh. I am sure everyone says that. Still, you see, there is drawbacks. Her ways are different from the ways of the ladies about here, and that keeps her apart from them. She don't drive about and call and make herself sociable like, nor see to the charities down in the village. It ain't as though she doesn't give money, because I know that whenever the rector says there is a case wants help, she's ready enough with her purse, but she don't go among them or know anything about them herself. No, Mr. Hugh, your aunt is a wonderful nice lady, but you take my advice and bring home an English wife as mistress of the hall." When he came home for the Christmas holidays, Hugh found his uncle again at home. For a time matters went on smoothly. Mr. Tunstall made an evident endeavor to be friendly with him, talked to him about his life at school, asked whether he wished to go to the university when he left, and when Hugh said that he didn't see any use in spending 3 years of his life there when he did not intend entering any of the professions, and that he would much rather travel and see something of foreign countries, he warmly encouraged the idea. "Quite right, Hugh. There is nothing opens a man's mind like foreign travel. But don't stick in the great towns. Of course you will want a year to do Europe. After that, strike out a line of your own. If I had my time over again, I would go into Central Asia or Africa, or some place where there was credit to be gained and some spice of adventure and danger." "That is just what I should like, uncle," Hugh said eagerly, and looking at his aunt for confirmation, he was surprised to see her watching her husband intently beneath her half-closed eyelids. "Don't you think so, aunt?" "I don't know, Hugh," she said quietly. "There is a good deal to be said both ways. But I don't think we need settle it now. You have another year and a half at school yet, you know." Hugh went out skating that afternoon, for it was a sharp frost. After he was passing through the hall on his return, he heard his uncle's voice raised in anger in the drawing-room. He paused for a moment. He could not catch the words, for they were spoken in Mexican. There was silence for a moment, and he imagined that his aunt was answering. Then he heard a loud exclamation in Mexican, then a slight cry and a heavy fall. He rushed into the room. His aunt lay upon the hearthrug. His uncle was standing over her with clenched hand. "You coward! You brutal coward!" Hugh exclaimed, rushing forward and, throwing himself upon his uncle, he tried to force him back from the hearthrug. For a moment the fury of his assault forced his uncle back, but the latter's greatly superior strength then enabled him to shake off his grasp, and the moment he was free he struck the lad a savage blow across the face that sent him reeling backwards. Mad with passion, Hugh rushed to the fender and, seizing a poker, sprang at his uncle. William Tunstall's hand went behind him, and as Hugh struck he leveled a pistol. But he was too late. The blow came down heavily as the pistol exploded in the air. As the man fell back, his head came with terrible force against the edge of a cabinet, and he lay immovable. Hugh's passion was stilled in an instant. He dropped the poker and leaned over his uncle. The blood was flowing down his forehead from the blow he had given him, but it was the injury to the back of the head that most alarmed the lad. He lifted an arm, and it fell heavily again. He knelt down and listened, but could hear no sound of breathing. He rose to his feet and looked down, white and trembling, at the body. "I have killed him," he said. "Well, he brought it on himself, and I didn't mean it. It was the cabinet that did it. Perhaps he is only stunned. If he is, he will charge me with trying to murder him. Well, it is no use my staying here. They will be here in a moment," and he glanced at the door. But the servants at Burnside were so accustomed to the sound of pistol shots that they paid no attention to it. Hugh picked up the weapon that had dropped from his uncle's hand and put it in his pocket, then glanced at his aunt and hesitated. "She will come round in time," he muttered, "and I can do nothing for her." Then he walked out of the room, turned the key in the door, and took it with him. He went out to the stable and ordered his horse to be saddled, keeping in the stable while it was being done, so that his white face should not attract notice. As soon as the horse was brought out, he leapt into the saddle and galloped off. Chapter 5. Across the Sea. Mr. Randolph was at dinner when the servant came in and said that young Mr. Tunstall wished to speak to him. He was in the library and begged the lawyer to give him 2 minutes' conversation. Hugh was walking up and down the little room when he entered. The old lawyer saw at once that something was wrong. "What is it, Hugh? What is the matter, lad?" "A good deal is the matter, Mr. Randolph, but I don't want you to ask me. I am sure you will be glad afterwards that you didn't know. You were a friend of my father's, sir. You have always been very kind to me. Will you give me £50 without asking why I want it?" "Certainly I will, lad, but in heaven's names don't do anything rash." "Anything that was to be done is done, Mr. Randolph. Please let me have the money at once. You don't know how important it is. You will know soon enough." Mr. Randolph unlocked his desk without a word and handed him 10 5-pound notes. Then he said, "By the way, I have gold if you would rather have it. There were some rents paid this afternoon." "I would much rather have gold." Mr. Randolph put the notes in the desk and then unlocked the safe. "Would you rather have 100? "Yes, sir, if you will let me have them." The lawyer handed him a small canvas bag. "God bless you, sir," the lad said. "Remember, please, whatever you hear, it was done in self-defense." Then, without another word, he opened the door and was gone. "Why, what is the matter, my dear?" Mrs. Randolph exclaimed, as her husband returned to the dining-room. "Why, you are as pale as death." "I don't know what is the matter exactly," he said. "Hugh has borrowed £100 of me and is gone." "Gone? Where has he gone to?" "I don't know, my dear. I sincerely hope he is going out of the country and can get away before they lay hands on him." "Why, what has happened?" "I don't know what has happened. I know things haven't been going on well for some time at Burnside. I'm afraid there's been a terrible quarrel. He begged me to ask him no questions, and I was glad not to do so. The less one knows, the better. But I am afraid there has been a scuffle. All he said was, just as he went out, "Whatever you hear, remember I did it in self-defense." "But goodness gracious, Thomas, you don't mean to say that he has killed his uncle?" "I don't mean anything," the lawyer said. "Those were his words. I'm afraid it won't be long before we hear what he meant. If they come to ask me questions, fortunately, I know nothing. I shall say no word except before a magistrate, and then my story is simple enough. He came and asked me to let me have £100, and as I was his trustee and have the rents of his estate for the past 5 years in my hands, I let him have it as a matter of course. I did not ask him why he wanted it. I saw that he was agitated, and from his manner and from my knowledge that he and his uncle did not get on very well together, I judged there had been a quarrel and that he intended to leave home for a while. It was only when he was leaving the room that I gathered there had been any personal fracas, and then, from his words, it was done in self-defense. I judged that his uncle had struck him, and that he had probably struck him in return. I hope that is all, my dear. I pray heaven that it may be all." Hugh had dismounted just outside the town, opened a gate leading to a field, taken off his horse's bridle, and turned the horse in and closed the gate behind it. Then he had turned up the collar of his coat, pulled his hat down over his eyes, and made his way to the lawyer's. He had cooled down now, but still felt no regret for what had passed. "He would have killed me," he said to himself, "and I had no thought of killing him when I knocked him down. Anyhow, he brought it on himself. If he is dead, and I am pretty sure he is, I have no one to prove that it was done in self-defense. But if he is not dead, he will give his own version of it when he recovers. I know he is a liar, and in his quiet manner he would be able to make every one believe that I had attacked him without the least provocation. He might even say that I fired the pistol, that he knocked it out of my hand, and that I sprang upon him and struck him down with his head against that cabinet. Either way, I shall get years of imprisonment if I am caught, but I don't mean to be caught if I can help it." On leaving Mr. Randolph's, he proceeded to the railway station, consulted the timetables, and then took a third-class ticket to Glasgow. He bought a Bradshaw, and sitting down on a bench under a light, turned to the advertisements of the sailing of steamers. By the time he had done that, the train came in. It was a slow one, stopping at every station. He got out at the first station and paid the fare from Carlisle, then walked back to the town and took a second-class ticket by the night mail for London. Arriving at Euston, he walked across to the docks, whence he had found that a steamer started for Hamburg at 8 o'clock, and he would catch a transatlantic steamer that started the next day. On his arrival in Hamburg, he went to the steamboat office and took a second-class ticket to New York. Having done this, he bought at a shop near the wharves a supply of clothes for the voyage, placed them in a cheap German trunk, and walked on board the steamer. He was now, he thought, fairly safe from pursuit. The hour at which he would arrive at the station at Carlisle would be known, and as the northern train was nearly due, and someone answering to his description had taken a ticket to Glasgow, it would be at once suspected that he intended to sail by a steamer from that port. No pursuit could be set on foot before the morning. Indeed, it was probable that before the police took the matter fairly in hand, it would be late in the afternoon. It might then be another day before they picked up the clue that he had gone to Glasgow and followed him there. If a steamer had happened to start that morning or the day before, it would be supposed that he had gone by it, and they might telegraph across and search the ship for him when it arrived at New York. If no steamer had started, and they could obtain no clue to him in Glasgow, they would think that he had gone back to Liverpool and would make search there, watching all the steamers sailing. They would in any case hardly suspect that he could have gone up to London, across to Hamburg, and caught the steamer sailing from there. Indeed, it would not have been possible for him to do so had he first gone up to Glasgow, as they would believe he had done. As soon as the vessel was fairly under way, Hugh looked round. On deck there was no distinction made between second-class emigrants and steerage, but it was easy to distinguish the two classes. The second class kept somewhat together near the companion leading to their portion of the ship, while the steerage passengers were well forward. The number of the latter was not very large, for the emigrant traffic across the Atlantic was carried principally in sailing ships. The second class were composed chiefly of substantial-looking Germans, for the most part farmers going out with a small amount of capital to settle in the West. There were 2 or 3 other young Englishmen, and with one of these, named Luscombe, Hugh struck up an acquaintance before he had been many hours on board. He was a young man of about 20, and Hugh soon learned from him that he was the son of a large landed proprietor in Norfolk. He had for a few months been in a crack regiment of hussars, but had gone, as he expressed it, a fearful mucker. His father had paid the greater portion of his debts, but had refused to settle some that he considered debts of honor. Luscombe, therefore, sold out, and was now, as he expressed it, going over to knock about it for a bit in the States, till his father took a sensible view of things. It was rough on him, he said, for I had run him up a pretty heavy bill twice before. However, I think it is all for the best. I should never have got out of that line if I had stopped in the regiment. 2 or 3 years knocking about and hard work won't do me any harm, and by that time the governor will be prepared to receive the prodigal son with open arms. Hugh was slower in giving his confidence, but before the voyage was over he had told Luscombe why he had left England. "Well, you did quite right, of course," Luscombe said, "in knocking that brute of a fellow down, and if you did split his skull and make your aunt a widow, you have nothing to reproach yourself with. Still, I agree with you that it will be more pleasant for you if he gets round, as I dare say he will, or else it will be a long while before you can show up at home. Well, you will know by the time we have been in New York a few days. If the papers the next mail brings out don't say anything about it, you may be sure he has got over it. 'A gentleman killed by his nephew' would be a startling heading, and if it is not there, you may go about your work with a light heart." The voyage was marked by no incident whatever. On arriving at New York, Luscombe and Hugh put up at a good hotel for a few days before making a start west. They had agreed to keep together, at any rate for a time. Luscombe was several years older than Hugh, but he saw that the lad had plenty of good sense and a fund of resolution, and knew that he himself was more likely to stick to work in such companionship than he should be by himself. Luscombe's light-hearted carelessness amused Hugh, and though he did not think that his companion was likely to stick very long to anything he took up, he was very glad to have his companionship for a time. Hugh was thankful indeed when the next mail brought a batch of papers of a date a week later than that of his leaving Cumberland, and when a careful examination of the file disclosed no allusion whatever to the event at Burnside. "Well, I congratulate you, Hugh," Luscombe said when he told him. "I expected it would be all right. If he had been a good old man you would have killed him, no doubt, but bad men always have wonderfully thick skulls. Well, now you are ready, I suppose, to make our start tomorrow." "Quite ready, Luscombe. We are only throwing away our money here." They had already made many enquiries, and had settled that they would in the first place go down to Texas, and would there take the first job of any kind that offered itself, keeping it until they had time to look round to see what would suit them best. Luscombe, however, said frankly that he thought it probable that sooner or later he should enlist in the cavalry out west. "I know I shall never stick to hard work very long, Hugh. I've not got my fortune to make, and I only want to pass away the time for a year or two until the old lady and the girls get the governor into a charitable state of mind again. Here is a first-rate fellow, and I am not surprised that he cut up rough at last. I expect a few months will bring him round, but I should not know what to do if I went back. I will give myself 3 years, anyhow." "I'm very much in the same position, Luscombe. I shan't go back until I come of age. Then I can snap my fingers at my uncle. I have got a very good trustee who will look after the estate. I will write to him tonight and let him know that I am all right and very glad to find that uncle has not been killed, and that he may expect me when I come of age, but not before." On the following morning they took their places in the train and traveled west, and proceeded to what was then the nearest terminus to their destination, northern Texas. Traveling sometimes by stage wagons, sometimes on foot, they arrived at McKinney, which they had been told was a young place, but growing fast. "Well, here we are at last," Luscombe said as they alighted at a one-storied building, on which was a board roughly painted, "The Empire Hotel." "At any rate, the scenery is better than it has been for the last 200 or 300 miles. There are some good-sized hills. Some of those across the country ahead might almost claim to be mountains, and that is a relief to the eyes after these dreary flats. Well, let us go in and have a meal first, then we will look around. The place has certainly not an imposing aspect." The meals here, as at the other places where they had stopped, consisted of fried steak, which, although tough, was edible, and abundance of potatoes and cabbages, followed by stewed fruit. They had arrived just at the dinner hour, and 7 or 8 men in their shirt-sleeves came in and sat down with them. The tea was somewhat better than they had hitherto obtained, and there was, in addition, the luxury of milk. Scarcely a word was spoken during the meal. It was evidently considered a serious business, and the chief duty of each man was to eat as much as possible in the shortest possible time. After the meal was over, and the other diners had gone out, the landlord, who had taken his seat at the top of the table, opened the conversation. "Are you thinking of making a stay here, gentlemen?" "Yes, if we can get any work to suit us," Luscombe said. "It is a rising place," the landlord said as he lit his pipe. "There are 2 stores and 8 houses being built now. The town has a great future before it. Luscombe and Hugh had some difficulty in preserving their gravity. "It is the chief town of the county," the landlord went on. "They are going to set about the courthouse in a month or two. Our sheriff is a pretty spry man and doesn't stand nonsense. We have an orderly population, sir. We had only 2 men shot here last week." "That is satisfactory," Luscombe said dryly. "We are peaceable characters ourselves. And is 2 about your average?" "Well, I can't say that," the landlord said. "That would be too much to expect. The week before last, Buck Harris with 3 of his gang came in and set up the town." "What do you mean by set up?" Luscombe asked. The landlord looked surprised at the question. "Oh, to set up a town is to ride into it, and to clear out the saloons, and to shoot at anyone seen outside their doors, and to ride about and fire through the windows. They had done it 3 or 4 times before, and as 4 or 5 men had been killed, the citizens became annoyed." "I am not surprised at that," Hugh put in. "The sheriff got a few men together, and the citizens began to shoot out of their windows. Buck Harris and 2 of his gang were killed, and 4 of the citizens. Since then we have had quiet. And what sort of work do you want, gentlemen? Perhaps I could put you in the way of getting it." "Well, we wanted to get work among horses," Luscombe said. The landlord shook his head. "You want to go further south among the big ranches for that. This is not much of a horse country. If you had been carpenters now, there would have been no difficulty. A good workman can get his $4 a day. Then there is James Pawson's woodyard. I reckon you might get a job there. One of his hands got shot in that affair with Buck Harris, and another broke his leg last week. I should say there was room for you there. Madden, that's the man who was shot, used to board here." "What is your charge for boarding, landlord?" 75 cents a day for 3 square meals, $1 a day if you lodge as well, but I could not lodge you at present. I must keep a couple of rooms for travelers, and the others are full. But you will have no difficulty in getting lodgings in the town. You can get a room for about $1 a week." "Well, let us try the woodyard, Luscombe." "All right," Luscombe said. "There's a certain sense of novelty about a woodyard. Well, landlord, if we agree with this Mr. Pawson, we will arrange to board with you at any rate for the present." They went down the straggling street until they came to a lot on which was piled a quantity of sawn timber of various dimensions. The name Pawson was painted in large letters on the fence. A man and a boy were moving planks. "Here goes," Luscombe said, and entered the gate. "Want a job?" the man asked, looking up as they approached him. "Yes, we are on the lookout for a job and heard there might be a chance here." "I am James Pawson," the man said, "and I want hands. What wages do you want?" "As much as we can get," Luscombe replied. Pawson looked them up and down. "Not much accustomed to hard work, I reckon." "Not much," Luscombe said, "but we are both plenty strong and ready to do our best." "Well, I tell you what," the man said. "I will give you $1.50 a day for a week, and at the end of that time, if you get through your work well, I will raise it to $2. Luscombe looked at Hugh, who nodded. "All right," he said, "we'll try." Pawson gave a sigh of relief, for hands were scarce. "Take off your coats, then," he said, "and set to work right here. There is a lot to be done." Luscombe and Hugh took off their coats and were soon hard at work moving and piling planks. Before they had been half an hour at it, there was a shout, and a wagon heavily laden with planks entered the yard. James Pawson himself jumped up onto the wagon and assisted the teamster to throw down the planks, while the other 2 carried them away and stacked them. Both of them had rolled up their sleeves to have a freer use of their arms. The sun blazed hotly down, and they were soon bathed in perspiration. They stuck to their work until 6 o'clock, but by that time their backs were so stiff with stooping that they could scarcely stand upright, and their hands were blistered with the rough wood. Pawson was well satisfied with their work. "Well," he said, "you move about pretty spry, you 2 do, and handle the wood quicker'n most. I see you will suit me if I shall suit you, so I will make it $2 a day at once. I ain't a man that stints half $1 when I see hands work willing." "Well, that is not a bad beginning, Luscombe," Hugh said as they went to put on their coats. "We have earned $1, Hugh," Luscombe said, "and we have broken our backs and blistered our hands, to say nothing of losing 3 or 4 pounds of solid flesh." "We did wrong to turn up our sleeves," Hugh said. "I had no idea that the sun was so strong. Why, my arms are a mass of blisters." "So are mine," Luscombe said ruefully, "and they are beginning to smart furiously. They will be in a nice state tomorrow." "Let us stay at the hotel tonight, Hugh. I feel so tired that I am sure I could never set out to look for lodgings after supper." The next morning their arms were literally raw. Before starting to work, they got some oil from the landlord and rubbed them. "It will be some time before I turn up my sleeves to work again," Luscombe said. "I have had my arms pretty bad sometimes after the first long day's row in summer, but I have never had them like this." They worked until dinner time, and then Luscombe went up to Pawson and pulled up his sleeve. "I think," he said, "you must let us both knock off for the day. We are really not fit to work. We daren't turn up our sleeves, and yet the flannel rubbing on them makes them smart so that we can hardly work. Besides, as you said yesterday, we are not accustomed to work. We are so stiff that we are not doing justice either to ourselves or you. If you have any particular job you want done, of course we will come after dinner and do it. But if not, we would rather be off altogether." "Your arms are bad," Pawson said. "I thought yesterday when you were working that, being newcomers, you would feel it a bit. Certainly you can knock off. You ain't fit for it as you are. Take it easy, boys, for a few days till you get accustomed to it. We ain't slave drivers out here, and I don't expect nothing beyond what is reasonable. I should get my arms well rubbed with oil at once, then tonight wash the oil off and give them a chance to harden, and in the morning powder them well with flour." As soon as they had had their dinner, they went out and found a room with 2 beds in it, and moved their small kits across there. Then they took a stroll around the town, of which they had seen little, and then lay down in the shade of the thick cactus hedge and dozed all the afternoon. The next morning they felt all the better for their rest. The inflammation of their joints had greatly abated, and they were able to work briskly. "What do you want with that revolver of an evening, Hugh, when you do not wear it during the day?" Luscombe asked as he saw Hugh put his revolver in his pocket when they went to their lodgings for a wash, after work was over for the day. "I take off my coat during the day, Luscombe, and whatever may be the custom here, I think it ridiculous to see a man at work in a wood yard with a revolver stuck into his pocket at the back of his trousers. At night it is different. The pistol is not noticed under the coat, and I don't suppose there is a man here without one." "I think one is just as safe without a pistol," Luscombe said. "Even these rowdies would hardly shoot down an unarmed man." "They might not if they were sober," Hugh agreed, "but most of this shooting is done when men are pretty nearly, if not quite, tipsy. I heard my uncle say once, a man may not often want to have a revolver on him, but when he does want a revolver, he wants it pretty badly." A few days later they heard at supper that 3 notorious ruffians had just ridden into the place. "I believe one of them is a mate of Buck Harris, who was shot here 3 weeks ago. I hear he has been in the bar swaggering about and swearing that he means to wipe out every man in the place who had a hand in that business. The sheriff is away. He went out yesterday with 2 men to search for a fellow who murdered a man and his wife somewhere down south, and who has been seen down in the swamps of the East Fork. He may be away 2 or 3 days, worse luck. There is the under-sheriff, but he isn't much good by himself. He can fight, Gilbert can, but he never likes going into a row on his own account. He will back up the sheriff in anything he does, but he has got no head to take a thing up by himself." "But surely," Hugh said, "people are not going to let 3 men terrorize the whole place and shoot and carry on just as they like." "Well, mate, I don't suppose we like these things more than anyone else, but I can tell you that when one of the 3 men is Dutch Sam, and another is Wild Harvey, and the third is Black Jake, it is not the sort of business as anyone takes to kindly, seeing that if there is one thing more tarnal sartain than another, it is that each of them is good to lay out 5 or 6 men before he goes under. When things are like that, one puts up with a goodish lot before one kicks. They are 3 as ugly men as there are anywhere along this part of Texas. Any one of them is game to set up a town by himself, and when it comes to 3 of them together, I tell you it would be a game in which I certainly should not like to take a hand. You are new to these parts, mate, or you wouldn't talk about it so lightly. When you have been out here for a few months, you will see that it is small blame to men if they get out of the way when 2 or 3 fellows like this are on the warpath." At this moment there was a sound of shouting and yelling, with a clatter of horses' hoofs outside. Then came the rapid discharge of firearms, and the 3 upper panes of glass in the window were pierced almost simultaneously with small round holes in the very centers. Every one bent down over their plates. The next shot might come through the second line of window panes, in which case they would have taken effect among those sitting at the table. Then there was a yell of laughter, and the horses were heard to gallop furiously away. "That is only their fun at present," one of the men said. "It will be more serious later on when they have drunk enough to be savage." "I don't see much fun in firing through the windows of a house," Luscombe said. "Oh, that is nothing," another put in. "I have seen a score of cowboys come into a place, and half an hour afterwards there wasn't a window pane that hadn't a round hole in its middle. They will shoot the hats off a score of men. That is one of their favorite amusements. In the first place, it shows their skill with the pistol. and in the next it scares people pretty nigh to death, and I have seen the cowboys laugh until they have nearly tumbled off their horses to see a fella jump and make a straight line into a house. Nobody minds the cowboys. They're a good sort. They are reckless enough when they are on a spree, but they don't really mean to do harm. They spend their money freely, and they hate ruffians like those three fellows outside. If it wasn't for cowboys, the bad men, as we call them, would be pretty well masters of Texas. But the cowboys hunt them down like vermin, and I have known them to hang or shoot over a dozen murderers and gamblers in one afternoon. They fight among themselves sometimes pretty hard. Perhaps the men on two ranches will quarrel, and then if it happens that a party from one ranch meets a party from the other down in a town, there's sure to be trouble. I remember one battle in which there were over 20 cowboys killed, besides 6 or 8 citizens who happened to get in the way of their bullets. Just as they had finished the meal, a man ran in. "Have you heard the news? Dutch Sam and his party have broken open the door of the undersheriff's house, pulled him out, and put a dozen bullets into him." There was an exclamation of indignation. "There," Hugh said, "if the undersheriff had done his duty and called upon everyone to help him to capture or shoot these fellows as soon as they came into the town, he wouldn't have lost his life, and I suppose it will have to be done after all." "The best thing we can do," one of the men said, "is to go round from house to house and agree that every man shall take his rifle and pistol and take his stand at a window, and then we will shoot them down as they ride past." "But that wouldn't be giving them a fair show," another objected. "A fair show," the other repeated scornfully. "Did they give the undersheriff a fair show? Do you think they give notice to a man before they shoot him and ask him to draw and be fairly heeled before they draw a trigger? Not a bit of it, and I say we ought to clear them out." There was a general expression of approval, and after one of the party had opened the door and looked out cautiously to see if the coast was clear, and reported that none of the desperadoes were in sight, the party at once scattered. Luscombe and Hugh stopped for half an hour chatting with the landlord. The latter did not believe that the people would attack the ruffians. "If the sheriff had been here to take the lead," he said, "they might have acted, but as he is away, I don't think it is likely that any one will draw a beat upon them. You see, no one is sure of any one else, and he knows that if he were to kill or wound one of them, the others would both be upon him. If we had a regular street here with a row of houses running along each side so that a volley could be poured into them, it would be a different thing. But you see, the houses are separated. Some stand back from the road, some stand forward. They are all scattered like, and I don't expect any one will begin. They will be in here presently," he said, "and they will drink my bar pretty well dry, and I don't expect I shall get a dime for the liquor they drink, and that is not the worst of it. They are like enough to begin popping at the bottles and smashing more than they drink." "Well, it seems to me a disgraceful thing," Hugh said, "that a place with something like 100 men in it should be kept down by 3. "It sounds bad if you put it that way," the landlord agreed, "but you must remember that each of these 3 men could hit every pip on a card 20 yards away. They each carry 2 revolvers, that is to say, they have got 12 men's lives in their belt, and they are so quick with their weapons that they could fire the 12 shots before an ordinary man could get out his revolver and cock it." "Why not shut up your place for the night?" Luscombe asked. "Then they couldn't come in and drink your spirits and wreck your bar." "They couldn't, eh? Well, they would blow the door open with their pistols, and if it was so barred they couldn't get in that way, they would like enough burn the house about my ears. I have known such things done many times." "Well, let us get home, Hugh," Luscombe said. "It seems to me the sooner we are quietly in bed, the better. As our room is at the back of the house, they may fire away as much as they like without a chance of our being hit." Hugh put on his hat, and the two started down the street. They had gone but a short distance when the sound of a horse's hoofs was heard. "Here's one of them," a voice shouted from an upper window. "Run round to the back of the house. The door is open there. I have heard 2 or 3 pistol shots, and he will shoot you down to a certainty." "Come on, Hugh," Luscombe said. "You go round, Luscombe. You're unarmed." "I am not going to run away from anyone," Hugh said doggedly. "Go on, man. It is no use your staying here. You have no pistol." "I shan't leave you by yourself," Luscombe said quietly. "Besides, here he comes." Hugh's hand had already slipped round to his back, and he now had his pistol in his hand in the pocket of his coat. The horseman threw up his arms as he came along, and Hugh saw the glitter of the moonlight on a pistol barrel. Another instant the pistol cracked, but Hugh, the moment he saw it bear on him, dropped onto one knee, and the ball struck the wall just above his head. He lifted his arm and fired, while 2 other shots rang out from the window. The man threw up his hands and fell back over the crupper of his horse to the ground, and the well-trained animal stopped instantaneously in his gallop, and turning, stood still by his side. "Come on, Luscombe," Hugh said. "The sooner we are out of this, the better." Before, however, they had gone 20 yards, they heard the sound of 2 horses coming up behind them. "Let us get round the corner of that house, Luscombe. I don't suppose they will pass those men at the windows. If they do, they will be thinking of their own safety as they gallop past, and won't notice us." They had scarcely got round the corner when there was a discharge of firearms, and the reports of the rifles were followed by the quick, sharp cracks of revolvers. Then a man dashed past them at a gallop. One of his arms hung by his side, and the reins were loose on the horse's neck. "I suppose they have killed the other," Hugh said, "and this fellow is evidently hit. Well, let us go on to bed." Luscombe did not speak until they reached their room. Hugh struck a match and lighted a candle. "Well, you are a nice lad, Hugh," Luscombe said. "I thought you were always against quarrels and wanted nothing but to go on with your work peaceably, and here you are throwing yourself into this and standing the chance of being shot as if you had been fighting ruffians all your life." "It was he attacked me," Hugh said. "I didn't fire first. I gave him no provocation and was not going to run away when I was armed. It is you ought to be blamed, stopping there to be shot at when you had no weapon. I call it the act of a madman. Well, there is nothing more to say about it, so let us get into bed." Chapter 6. A Horse Deal. After having been at work for a week, Hugh and Luscombe found it comparatively easy to them. Their hands had hardened, and their back and legs no longer ached with the exertion of stooping and lifting planks and beams. They had now got the yard into order, the various lengths and thicknesses of planks piled together, and also the various sized timber for the framework of the houses. Their work was now more varied. The dray had, of course, to be unloaded on its arrival from the mills and its contents stowed away, and as soon as James Pawson found that his new hands could be trusted to see after things, he left them pretty much to themselves, going up himself to the mill of which he was part owner. It now fell to them to keep an account of the outgoings, to see that the planks they handed over to purchasers were of the right lengths and thicknesses, and also to saw the woodwork of the frames for the houses into their required lengths. All this afforded a change and gave them an interest in their work, and they came to know a good many, not only of those living in the town, but men who were taking up ground in the neighborhood, and who came in with their teams for planks and shingles to construct the rough houses which were to shelter them until, at any rate, they got their land under cultivation and things began to prosper. 3 months after their arrival, Luscombe began to show signs of getting wearied of the work. Hugh was quick to notice it. "I can see you are getting tired of it," he said one Sunday as they started for a walk to a small ranch 3 miles away, whose owner had been buying wood for a cow house and had asked them to come over for dinner. "You didn't mean me to see it, but I know that it is so." "I don't know that I am tired, Hugh, but I feel a restless sort of feeling." "Well, my dear Luscombe, I don't want you to feel that you are in any way bound here on my account. We agreed that from the first, you know. It was a great thing our being together at first, but now the ice is broken, we have fallen into the groove and can either of us shoulder our kits and go where we like in search of a job. We are no longer fresh from the other side of the Atlantic." "I shall carry out my idea of enlisting," Luscombe said. "There is a military post at Fort McKayett. I can strike down by road to Meridian. I can get wagons as far as that, pick up a horse for a few dollars there, and then make my way down until I strike the Colorado River, and, crossing that, bear west, stopping at cattle ranches until I get to the fort. I shall be happier as a trooper than at any other work. Of course the pay is not high, but that does not matter a rap to me. It goes further here than it does at home, and there is not much use for money out on the plains. They say the Indians are very troublesome, and there will be some excitement in the life, while here there is none. I don't like leaving you, Hugh. That is the only drawback." "Don't let that stop you," Hugh said. "Of course I shall be very sorry when you go, but as you have your plans and I have none, it would come at any rate before long, and, as I have said, now that I have got over the feelings of strangeness, I don't suppose that I shall stay here long after you have left." The following day Luscombe told his employer that he should leave at the end of the week. "I'm sorry you're going," he said, "but I expected that you would be on the move before long. That is the worst of it out here. Nobody sticks to a job. However, I cannot blame you. You have stopped a good bit longer than they generally do. And are you going too?" he asked, turning to Hugh. "Not just yet," Hugh replied, "but I do think of going in another week or two. You see, boss, one is not learning anything here." "That's so. Say, would you like to go up to the mill for a bit? That is different sort of work, and as you say, you would be learning something. One of the men jammed his hand on Saturday and won't be fit for that kind of work for some time, so as your mate is going off at the end of the week, you can go up there if you like." Hugh gladly accepted the offer. He would have felt it very dull without Luscombe, but by going to a different sort of work he would feel his companion's departure less hardly. He would have much to learn, and be among new companions, and have much to attend to. So, at the end of the week, Luscombe set out upon his long journey to Fort McKayett, and on Monday morning Hugh started for the sawmill at daybreak in a wagon that had come in on Saturday afternoon with timber. James Pawson had told him that he had spoken to the foreman about him, and the latter would know what to do with him. The team consisted of 2 fine mules in the shafts and 2 horses ahead. "Climb up," the driver said. "We shall go a goodish pace till we get to the hills. That is right, hold on." As he cracked his whip, the animal started at a trot and presently broke into a gallop. The road was nothing but a track across the country, and Hugh held on to the seat, expecting every moment to be jerked off. The track was as hard as iron, but the passages of the wagons in wet weather had worn deep holes and ruts in it, and Hugh thought it was a miracle that the wagon did not upset and smash to pieces, as the wheels went down first on one side and then on the other, and the whole framework creaked and quivered with the shock. At the end of about 3 miles, the animals slackened their pace, to Hugh's intense relief. "That's just their little play," the driver said. "They know they won't get a chance again today, and they generally lay themselves down for a gallop where it is good going." "Do you call that good going?" Hugh asked in astonishment. "Sartin. Why, it is level ground and not a watercourse to go over. You don't expect a railway track graded and level, do you?" Hugh hastened to say that he entertained no such extravagant ideas. "This road ain't nowhere, so to speak, real bad," the driver went on. "That is, not for a hill road. I don't say as there ain't some baddish places, but nothing to what I have driven teams over." The animals had now dropped down into a walk, although, so far as Hugh could see, the track was no worse than that which they had been hitherto following. "The critters are just getting their breath," the driver said as he proceeded to light his pipe. "They have had their fling, and now they are settling down to the day's work. They know as well as I do what they have got before them, don't you, Pete?" The mule addressed lifted one of its long ears and partly turned his head around. "They are fine mules," Hugh remarked. "You will see bigger than them. Them's Mexicans, and they have wonderful big mules in North Mexico. I've seen them standing a hand higher than these. But Pete and Bob are good mules. They would be better if they were a bit heavier when it comes to a dead pull, but except for that I would as lief have them as the biggest." "Are they better than horses?" "Better than horses? You bet. Why, I'd rather have a pair of mules than 3 pair of horses. Why, for steady work and for stay and for strength, there ain't no comparison between a mule and a horse. Why, that pair of mules is worth twice as much as the best pair of horses you could find in Texas, except, of course, picked horses for riding. If you pay $100 for a horse, you have paid a long price in this country, but that pair of mules wouldn't be dear at $800 for the 2 of them. There is no trouble with mules. They won't stray far when you turn them out. They won't stampede, not if they are properly trained. Why, there is as much sense in a mule as there is in a score of horses, and the horses know it themselves. If there's a mule turned out among a troop of horses, he takes the lead natural, and they will follow him wherever he goes, knowing right well that he's got more sense than they have. Besides, mules seem to get fond of each other, and you don't see horses do that. In a roundup, the team horses will just mix up with the others. You don't see 2 of them keep together or have any sort of friendship, but if there are a pair of mules among the lot, you will see them keep together." "I had an idea that mules were obstinate beasts." "I won't deny as they have their temper sometimes, but in most cases it comes from their getting into bad hands. But treat a mule well, and he will, in general, do his best. When they once find they have got a job beyond them, they ain't going to break their hearts by trying to do it, and if they are treated bad when there is no call for it, then they puts up their backs and won't stir another foot. And when they makes up their minds to that, you may kill them, and they won't do it then. But treat a mule fair and kind, and there is no better beast in the world. You know all about it, Pete, don't you?" And he gave the animal a slight flick on the neck with his whip, to which it replied by throwing up its hindquarters and giving a playful kick, which caused Hugh, whose legs were hanging down over the front of the wagon, to withdraw them hastily. "You are a rascal, Pete," the driver said. "Come now, you've all got your winds. Just sharpen up a bit till you get among the hills." As if they understood what he said, the mules threw their weight on the traces, broke into a slow trot, and the crack of the driver's whip woke the leaders into activity. This pace was not kept up long, for the ground had now begun to rise. They presently entered a valley between 2 spurs of the hills, and soon began to mount by a rough road. This became steeper and steeper, and Hugh was glad to get off and walk in front. At times the track they had to cross was bare rock, so smooth and slippery that the animals could scarcely keep their feet and drag up the wagon. Then they wound along the side of a hill, the ground on one side being so much higher than on the other that it seemed to Hugh that a loaded wagon would infallibly topple over and go rolling down into the valley below. Sometimes they descended sharply into some lateral ravine cut by a stream and climbed up the other. The hills now were covered with a growth of small trees and brushwood. The larger timber had already been felled. At last the wagon turned up the bed of a stream running through a rocky gorge. "Here we are," the driver said, and 50 yards further they came upon the sawmill, a roughly built structure with a water wheel. A low log hut stood beside it. Beyond, the valley opened out. At the upper end its sides far up the hills were covered with trees, but the woodsman's axe had already stripped the lower part of the valley of all its timber trees. A dam had been built across the stream and a lead cut to the water wheel, which was sunk 5 or 6 feet below the level of the ground around it, and the tail race continued nearly down to the mouth of the gorge, where the water fell again into the old bed of the stream. The wheel was revolving, and the sound of the machinery inside the mill deadened that of the mules and wagon, but a shrill whistle from the driver brought a man to the door. He nodded to Hugh. "You're the new hand the boss spoke of, I suppose? Well, Clarkson, have you brought the things we wanted?" "Yes, I think the list is complete. I gave it to the old man, and he had all the things on board the first thing this morning. Here they are: 6 pounds of tea, a barrel of pork, sack of flour, keg of molasses, 20 pounds of sugar. Here's a box of dried apples and the 2 cross-cut saws. He will see about a grindstone. He thinks you might make that one last a bit longer." "It was pretty well worn out when it was put up," the foreman grumbled. "It ain't fit to grind axes on. I told the boss the other day that it had cost him 10 times its value already, because the men couldn't keep a sharp edge on their tools with it." "Well, you know Ben, grindstones don't grow down in McKinney, and he's got to get them sent out from Missouri." "If he had to get them from China, he might have had one here by this time," the foreman grumbled. "Have you got that bag of iron dogs I wanted?" "No, there warn't one to be had in McKinney. The old man told me to tell you he rode off on Saturday to Little Rock and told them to express them on." A negro now came out from the hut and began to carry the provisions in, and Hugh followed the foreman into the mill. There was another man there. One side of the mill was open to a yard behind, in which lay the logs as brought down by the team. These were placed on rollers and so run into the mill. One end of the log was then lifted by a screw jack until level with the saw bench. Here it was packed up, and the jack then taken to the other end. The machinery consisted solely of one large circular saw and of another of smaller size. The water power would not have been sufficient to drive frame saws, and the whole work had to be done with the circular saws. The mill was not large, but it sufficed for the wants of McKinney and the neighborhood, and 2 wagon loads of planks were sent down daily. 3 axemen, who felled and squared the trees, and a teamster with 4 horses to drag the balks down to the mill completed the establishment. Hugh soon found that the work was far more interesting than it had been in the woodyard. It needed a good deal of skill to handle the heavy pieces of timber and get them upon the saw bench, although they were cross-cut by the woodmen into lengths suitable for planks. Then the great saw cut the balks into planks 3 inches wide. These were taken to the smaller saw, which ran them down into half, 3/4, or inch planks as required. The benches were of a primitive description, the balks being laid on fixed rollers, and the necessary movement given to them by a rope passed through blocks and taken round a shaft, which, as it revolved, wound up the rope and brought the logs forward against the saw. The noise at first of the saws and of the water wheel and its machinery almost deafened Hugh, but he soon ceased to notice it. He found that his duties were of a general kind. He assisted in raising the logs to their places and in getting them properly placed on the rollers, and then he helped to fix the blocks and pulleys, to remove the planks as they were cut off, and to work the log back to its place in readiness for another plank to be cut from it. The small saw required one man's constant attention, as the 3-inch planks were simply pushed forward by hand against it, being kept in their true position by guides. "You have got to be careful when you get near the end," the foreman said to him, "or you will find yourself without a finger or 2 in no time. When you get to within a foot of the end, you must not push the plank any further, but go on to the other end of the saw and pull it to you. It is a pretty rough business altogether, but it will only last another few months. There are not enough trees to supply it longer than that. Pawson has bought up another place a bit further among the hills, and he has ordered a better plant than this and reckons it will be up and ready to run by the time we are done here. This place ain't fit for carrying on much trade. When it was put up 2 years ago, there were but few people about on the plain, and a wagon load a week was about the outside Pawson could get rid of. I've been here from the first. In those days we used to work with our rifles handy, for there was always a chance of an attack by Indians, but the country has grown so much since then that the Indians move further north and don't bother us. Ah, there's Joe's dinner bell." Hugh, following the example of the others, went down to the mill stream and gave his hands a rinse, dried them on a towel hanging from a nail on the door of a hut, and then went in. In 5 minutes the whole party were assembled and took their seats on benches beside a long, narrow table. The negro cook brought in bowls of pea soup. This was followed by boiled pork and potatoes, and then came a great dish of dried apples boiled with molasses poured over them. "We get our board up here," the foreman, who had placed Hugh beside him, said. "I suppose the boss told you?" "Yes, he said I should get $40 a month and my grub." "That's it. It is better pay than you can get on a farm below, but it is harder work and lonesome. Besides, unless you are careful, you run a pretty good risk of an accident. There have been 8 or 10 fellows hurt here since we began. It is healthy among the hills, and we don't get fevers, and it is cool enough to sleep comfortably at night, even in summer. But in winter it is cold, I can tell you. The old man feeds us pretty well, I must say that for him, and he is as good a boss as there is about here." Hugh liked the life. The keen mountain air braced him up, and every day he found it more and more easy to do his share of the work of moving the heavy balks. The men as a whole were pleasant fellows, and of an evening Hugh listened with great interest to the stories they told as they smoked their pipes. It was wonderful how many occupations most of them had followed. 2 of them had been mining in California before they came down to Texas. One of them had been working with teams across the Santa Fe route. Another, named Bill Royce, had been a sailor, had deserted his ship at Galveston, had enlisted and served for 3 years at a cavalry post west, had deserted again, had worked for 2 years as a cowboy on one of the Texan ranches, had gone down into Mexico and worked at a ranch there, had come up by sea to Galveston, working his passage, had served as a farmhand for a few months, and then, after various experiences, had come to McKinney when there were only 3 or 4 houses there. Another of the men had also worked as a cowboy, but his experience had been but a short one. "I stopped just a week at it," he said, "and what with being thrown off a horse 20 times a day, and what with the work, and what with the goings-on of the boys, I had enough of it by that time. I had been in 1 or 2 Indian fights, and I didn't feel scared then, but those cowboys scared me pretty nigh to death. The way they let off their pistols was a caution. 4 or 5 times, when I was sitting quiet, smoking, bang, and a revolver bullet would knock my pipe into chips, and then they'd laugh fit to kill themselves when I got up and swore. Then, without the least reason, someone, as we were all sitting round the fire, would take it into his head to hit a little bit of flaming wood. Then half a dozen others would go at it, and the bits of fire would be sent flying in all directions, and how it was that none of them got killed was more than I could make out. I stood it for a week, and then I weakened. I had got that nervous that I would jump if a fellow moved suddenly, and I concluded that I was not made the same way as the cowboys and had better quit and take to some other job." "I reckon you were about right there," Bill Royce said. "Anyone as is thinking of going for a cowboy had best know how to ride, how to throw a rope, and how to draw his pistol as quick as lightning before he begins." The next day, Hugh asked the teamster to bring him up from the town a rope such as the cowherders used. "This will do," Bill Royce said as he examined it. "The cowboys and Mexicans both use ropes sometimes, but they chiefly make them themselves from strips of rawhide, which they work and grease until they run almost as easy as if they were made of silk. Yes, this is the right length, 40 feet. Some men will use 50, and I've known Mexicans who would throw a 60-foot length with certainty, but that is quite out of the way. 40 feet is the right length. I will splice one end into an eye for you. The other goes through it and makes a running noose. When you throw it, the loop is 3 or 4 feet across. Of course, the better you can throw, the smaller you can have the loop, and the smaller it is, the better, for the jerk comes all the quicker before the horse or steer is prepared for it. Now, you see that stump of a young tree sticking up 2 feet above ground? Well, you form your loop, and you gather the rest in coils in your hand like this, and you stand, to begin with, 20 feet away, and you cast the loop over the stump, so." Of an evening, when supper was over, Hugh went out and practiced with the rope, and at the end of a month found that he could throw it at a distance of 30 feet with a fair certainty of dropping the loop over the stump. He also took Royce's advice as to the pistol. He had laid it by since arriving at McKinney, but he now got a belt similar to those worn by the cowboys, and took to carrying the pistol in it, but unloaded, and at odd moments practiced drawing from the belt, leveling it, and pulling the trigger with the greatest possible speed. The action seemed simple enough, but he was surprised to find how, with practice, the time taken in doing it diminished, and his fingers came to close upon the handle in exactly the right position almost instantaneously, and as his hand shot out, his thumb drew back the hammer, and his forefinger closed on the trigger. All this he had practiced before, more or less, when he had learned to use the weapon in the conservatory at Burnside, but at that time it had not appeared probable the accomplishment would be of any use. Now he knew that his life might depend upon it, and he came in time to be able to perform it with, as Royce had said, something of the sleight of hand of a conjurer. He devoted the whole of his spare time to practicing with the pistol and rope, and by the time that summer had gone, Hugh was able to throw the rope with certainty over any fixed object within reach, and to draw his revolver with a quickness that astounded Bill Royce. "I have seen a lot of pistol shooting," the latter said, "since I came out west, cowboys and Mexicans and horse thieves and such like, but I have never seen one draw as quick as you do, and there are many as draws quick. You shoot fair, but nothing out of the way. There's many a cowboy can shoot a sight straighter, but for quick drawing you are wonderful, and that is the great thing. When one fellow gets his pistol out, the other one has got to cave in." The valley was now pretty well cleared of its trees, and the party prepared to go down to McKinney for the winter. The woodcutters were to move at once to the new location and to begin to fell trees, and as soon as the snow fell deep the teams would go up and drag them down to the new sawmill, for the timber is hauled down much more easily over the snow than over the rough ground in summer. Thus there would be a big stock in readiness when the thaw came and the mill began to work in the spring. Hugh was not sorry when the work of the mill came to an end. He had determined to remain until the season closed, and he was glad he had done so. The time had been by no means lost. He had learned a good deal as to the ways and character of the men with whom he should have to associate. He had from one or other of them picked up a great deal of knowledge about the country, and knew the best places for making a start, the towns from which most of the teams started, and the localities that were best to make for in order to gain the heart of the cattle country. He had learned to throw a rope with enough dexterity to aid him materially in any work he might undertake among cattle or horses, and his constant practice with his revolver gave him a confidence in himself and in his ability to hold his own in the wild life of the plains and mountains. In the 9 months which had elapsed since he left England, he had gained strength, had become manly and self-reliant, and felt that his apprenticeship had been of great value to him. The first thing to do after he came down to McKinney was to look out for a horse. He had been put up to a useful wrinkle in this respect by Bill Royce. "You be careful about any horse trade you make. Bet your boots that any horse that is offered to you here is stolen, and you would get into one of the awkwardest of scrapes if you chanced to go into a district where that horse is known. They don't trouble themselves to ask many questions over a stolen horse. If you buy a horse, the best thing to do is to go before a justice, or the sheriff will do, pay your money before him, and get him to sign his name as a witness to the bargain. His fee will be $1 or $2, and you could not lay out the money better. Men ain't altogether unreasonable, even where a horse is concerned, and a paper issued from a sheriff's office certifying that you had bought the horse and paid a fair price for it might save your neck from a noose. You may ride a stolen horse all your life and never happen to light on the place he was taken from, but if you do happen to light on it, you may find yourself in a tight corner." Hugh put up at the hotel, and having told the landlord that he was on the lookout for a horse, the latter told him one evening when he returned from a visit to some friends at a farm, that 2 men had come in an hour before and had said they had a good horse to dispose of. Bill Royce was sitting in the saloon when Hugh went in. "I dropped in to see you, Hugh. I saw 2 fellows come in an hour ago on 2 likely-looking horses, and they were leading 2 others, one of which seemed to me as good a bit of horseflesh as I have seen for a long time. I expect they are on for a trade. The horse is a mustang. I don't expect they come by it honest, but that ain't your business, and you will get it cheaper than if they had. Go slow in bargaining. Don't you let out you really want him." Presently 2 men came in. They were dressed in broad hats, red shirts, over which they wore jackets with silver buttons, breeches made of soft leather, and high boots. They wore bright-colored sashes round the waist. "They look pretty hard," Bill Royce said quietly. "They may be anything. They are not regular cowboys, but they may have been working on a ranch. They may have been prospecting. They may be horse thieves. They may be regular border ruffians. Anyhow, they've got a horse to sell. Maybe they have stole it from a ranch. Maybe they have got it from the Indians. Maybe they have wiped out its owner. You'll be able to tell pretty well by the price they want for it. He would be cheap at $200 if he is anything as good as he looks. If they will take anything under that, it is because they daren't keep him." After standing at the bar and talking for some time to the landlord, one of the men came across to Hugh. "I hear you're looking for a horse." "Yes, I am wanting to buy one if I find one to suit me at my price." "I've a horse to trade that would suit anyone, and as to its price, I'm ready to let him go a bargain." "I should like to have a look at him," Hugh said. "Well, he's in the stable now." Yes, but I should want to see him in daylight to get on his back and try him. Look here, the man said. Me and my mate are pressed for time. Perhaps we've got an appointment with the president. Perhaps we haven't. Anyhow, we want to go on. We've got 2 spare horses, and we don't wish to bother with them no further. Well, I will look at the horse now, Hugh said, and accompanied by Bill Royce, he followed the man to the stables. 2 horses were standing, ready saddled and bridled, hitched to hooks outside the shed. Inside were 2 others. One was an ordinary-looking horse, bony and angular. A pack saddle hung on a beam close by. He had evidently been used for carrying baggage. The other was a handsome roan, which snorted angrily as they approached with lanterns. That is something like a horse, the man said. 5 years old, strong and up to anything, clean-limbed, full of courage and fast. He has got a temper, Hugh said as the horse laid back his ears and made a sudden and vicious snap at the man's hand. He is a bit playful, the man said. Well, I don't like buying him without trying him, Hugh said. He may be up to all sorts of tricks and may kick his saddle over his head. What do you want for him? I'll tell you what, the man said. That horse would be dirt cheap at $250, but as I've told you, we want to be moving on, and I will sell him for $150. I would rather put a bullet through his head than let him go for less than that. Well, let us go back into the saloon and talk it over, Hugh said. It is a rum way to buy a horse, but I like his looks. The other man was still standing at the bar when they entered. Hugh, knowing that it would be an unheard-of thing to buy a horse without the ceremony of taking drinks being performed, went to the bar and ordered them for the 4. If I buy that horse, he said, it will be on one condition. You see, I don't know where he has come from. The man you got him from may have stolen him, and I might happen to come across the former owner, and I haven't any fancy for being strung up as a horse thief. You don't mean, stranger, to say as we have stolen him, one of the men said angrily. Not at all. It may have gone through 6 hands before it came into yours, and yet it may have been stolen. Of course, if you know anyone here who can guarantee that you raised the horse or have owned him for a couple of years, I shall be quite content. But if you don't, you can hardly expect me to take your word any more than I should expect them to take my word if a party were to ride up to me and accuse me of stealing it. That is right enough, isn't it, landlord? I don't see as there is anything to be said against that, the landlord said. It is a mighty unpleasant thing in this country to be found riding on the back of a horse that has mayhap been stolen. What I propose is this, Hugh went on. Seeing that these gentlemen are strangers here, I propose that I should call in the sheriff and James Pawson, who is a justice, and that they should witness the sale and give me a signed paper saying that they know me as a resident here, and that I have in their presence bought this horse. I don't think there is anything unreasonable in that. If at any time I am held up for stealing it, I can show the paper, and if they doubt it, they can write to the sheriff here and find that it is genuine. The 2 men exchanged a few words together in a low voice, and then the one who had shown the horse said, Well, I reckon that is fair enough offer. We know we came by the horse honestly, but as we are strangers, it is right enough you should be cautious. Bring your sheriff along and let's be done with it. I will fetch the sheriff across, Royce said, if you go over to Pawson's, Hugh. In 5 minutes they returned with the 2 men. The sheriff looked sharply at the 2 horse dealers. They were unknown to him. Will you give me my belt, landlord? Hugh said. The landlord went out and returned with Hugh's belt, which had been locked up in his chest since Hugh arrived in the town. The latter counted out $150 in gold. Wait a minute, the sheriff said. I must see the horse first and see what brand is on him. I cannot describe the horse unless I see him. Again, taking lanterns, the party went out to the stable. The horse had been branded with a circle in which was the letter E. There was no other mark on him. The sheriff brought across with him some official paper, and returning to the bar wrote, I bear witness to the purchase by, and he paused. Hugh Tunstall, Hugh put in, who is well known to me as having been working for 6 months in and near the town of a roan horse branded Circle E of Jake Whittingham, the man said, and to the passing of payment for the same. The sheriff then added his name, writing under it, Sheriff of McKinney County, and James Pawson added his signature with the word Judge. That is right and square, the sheriff said. Now hand over the money and the trade is done. I will throw in the other horse for $20. I will take it, Hugh said, and adding this sum to that he had counted out, handed it over to the men. If you will just step over with me, Hugh, the sheriff said, I will put my official seal to that paper. I have no doubt, he went on as they left the saloon, that those 2 fellows have stolen that horse. They would never have sold him for that money had they come by him honestly. I should have been glad to buy him myself for anything like that price. I don't know the men, and I reckon I know most of the rogues for 100 miles around here, so that if it has been stolen, it has probably been brought a good distance. I shouldn't be surprised if there has been murder as well as robbery. If I knew the men, I would seize them and have them searched, but as I have never seen them before and know nothing against them, I cannot do that. I think it is a very good idea of yours getting me in to witness the sale. That horse might yet get you into serious trouble if you could not prove that you came by it honestly." He had now reached his house and proceeded to stamp the document with the official seal. "You may as well put your signature to this," he said, "and I will witness it. Then if there is any question about your being Hugh Tunstall, you would only have to sign your name and they would see that you are the man mentioned. That is right. My fee is $2. Hugh gladly paid the money, and putting the document in his pocket, returned to the hotel. "Those fellows have just ridden off," Royce said when he entered. "Pretty hard couple, that. I wonder where they got that horse. Nowhere about here the sheriff would have known it. A horse like that would be sure to catch the eye." The next morning Hugh got up early to inspect his purchase. The horse again made hostile demonstrations when he approached it, but, talking to it quietly, Hugh went into the stall, patted and soothed it. When it had quieted down, he took the head rope and led it out into the yard. "You are a beauty," he said. "There is no mistake about that," and tying it up to a post, he walked round it. "Well put together, plenty of muscle, fine bone, and splendid quarters. What a hunter you would make if I had you at home." The landlord came out as he was admiring the animal. "A mustang," he said. "Bigger than they usually run a good bit, and a beauty all over. He's worth double what you gave for him. This is not much of horse country. If you had him down south, you could get 300 for him any day. I expect those fellows were afraid to take him down there. Too well known, I reckon. Look here, I'll give you a paper too, and if I were you, I would get another from Pawson saying that you have been working for him at his sawmill, and that he recommends you as a good hand at that work. You can't have too many certificates as to who you are when you're riding an animal like that in this country. If you want a saddle and bridle, Jim Hoskins has got one to sell. He was speaking to me about it a fortnight ago." Half an hour later, Hugh became the owner of a saddle and bridle. The former was made in the Texan fashion, which closely resembles the Mexican, being very heavy and with a high peak and cantle. "I hardly see how a man can be thrown off a horse with such a saddle as this," Hugh said as he examined it. "One would be boxed in before and behind." "Wait till you get on a bad bucking horse," the man said with a smile. "You won't wonder about it then." Carrying it back to the hotel, Hugh saddled his horse and mounted. He felt strange and uncomfortable at first, for the stirrup leathers were placed much further back than those to which he was accustomed. The stirrups were very large and broad, and the position of the stirrup leathers rendered it necessary for him to ride almost with a straight leg, so that his grip was with his thighs instead of his knees. "I shall get accustomed to him in time," he said to himself, "but at present I feel as if I was riding barebacked. Well, I had plenty of practice at that, so I ought to be able to stick on." He rode at a quiet pace down the street, and then shook the reins, and the horse at once started at a hand gallop. Hugh was delighted with his pace, which was wonderfully smooth and easy, and returned in an hour, fully satisfied with his purchase. Chapter 7. Among the Cowboys. "Well, now you've got your horse and outfit, Hugh, what are you going to do next?" Bill Royce said, after the rest of the party had got up from breakfast and gone out. "I don't quite know, Bill," Hugh laughed. "I thought of going teaming, but I am afraid my horse has spoilt me for that." "Well, I should say so." "I should like to be my own master for a bit," Hugh went on, "and do some shooting and hunting on the plains, work across to Santa Fe, and then take anything that turns up. I have got $300 in cash. That will last me for a long time. But I don't like striking out for myself. I know nothing of the country or the life. What do you say to going with me, Bill?" "That is just what I've been turning over in my mind," Bill said. "I know the plains powerful well and have been hunting and shooting there for months. I was saying to myself, as like enough you would be thinking of striking out for a bit before you settled down again to anything, and you would be wanting someone with you as could put you up to the ropes. I've got pretty sick of working here, but I have spent my money as fast as I've got it and cannot afford to get an outfit. So I said to myself, if Hugh likes to start me with an outfit, I think it would be about square, seeing as he knows nothing of the country and I could put him straight there. We've worked together for a bit, and I reckon we would get on first rate. So if that would suit you, it would just suit me." "It suits me capitally, Bill. Nothing could be better. It is just what I wanted. I don't suppose I should ever have gone by myself, but with you it would be the very thing to suit me. There's my hand to it." In another 3 days their preparations were made. Bill knew of a horse that could be picked up for $40. 2 rifles were bought, a saddle and a bridle for Bill, and saddlebags for the spare horse. A large stock of ammunition was laid in. 50 pounds of flour, a few pounds of tea and sugar, 4 blankets, and a few odds and ends completed the outfit. Royce had already a revolver, and on the morning of the 4th day they started from McKinney, striking nearly due south so as to work round the range of hills. For the first few days they passed occasional settlements, and then struck out across an open country. "Now we may begin to look out for game," Royce said. "You can shoot, I suppose, Hugh?" "I've had no practice whatever with the rifle, but I am a pretty good shot with the shotgun." "You will soon pick it up anyhow," Royce said. "Anyone who can shoot as you do with a Colt is sure to shoot pretty straight with a rifle." For the next 4 months Hugh and his companion wandered over the plains, and Hugh enjoyed the life immensely. They had directed their course toward the southwest, for winter was setting in when they started, and as the cold is sometimes severe in northern Texas, they made down towards the Mexican frontier, and there enjoyed delightful weather. They found an abundance of game and could have shot any number of deer, but they were useless to them except for food. Herds of wild horses were sometimes seen, and occasionally, in quiet valleys, they came across half-wild cattle which had strayed away from far distant ranches. It was strange to Hugh to travel thus at will, to wander freely in whichever direction fancy led them, sometimes passing a week or 2 without seeing any other human being, sometimes stopping for a night at the campfire of a party of cowboys, sometimes bivouacking with a wandering hunter like themselves or with a ranchman in search of stray animals. During this time their expenses had been next to nothing, their sole outlay being for flour, tea, and sugar, and even these they generally obtained in exchange for venison or other game. Hugh had learned to use his rope with considerable skill on horseback, for as soon as he got fairly away on the plains he had begun to practice. The first time he tried it upon his companion he would have given him a very heavy fall, had not Bill reined in his horse onto its haunches as soon as the rope fell over his shoulders, for Prince, as Hugh called his horse, was thoroughly up in his work. The instant the rope had been thrown he stopped and braced himself, with his forelegs extended, to meet the shock, and had it not been for Bill's quickness he would in an instant have been torn from the saddle. "Thunder!" the latter exclaimed. "Do you want to break my neck, Hugh?" "I had nothing to do with it," Hugh protested. "Prince nearly sent me over his head. I had not the least idea of pulling him in, and was perfectly taken aback by his playing me that trick." "We ought to have thought of it," Bill said. "It was dead sure he would be trained to the work. The idea flashed across me just as the rope came down, and lucky it was so. Well, you will find plenty of other things to practice on as we go along. There are cattle enough running about here without owners, and if you come across a bunch of wild horses you can give chase and rope some of the young ones, and there are coyotes, they will give you plenty of sport that way." Hugh had used all these opportunities and had come to throw the noose over the head of a flying animal as well as Bill Royce himself could do, but as yet he was unable to throw the rope round their legs with any certainty. As the spring approached, Hugh proposed that instead of carrying out their plan of going to Santa Fe, they should for a time take service on a ranch. "I enjoy this life immensely, Bill, and I should like to become thoroughly up to all the work. At present I am what you call a tenderfoot, and I should certainly like to have a few months among the cowboys." "Just as well do that as anything else," Bill said. "It is always handy to know that you can hold your own in a roundup and know the ways of cattle, and I tell you that there is plenty to learn. But, mind you, it ain't going to be like this time we've been having. There's no fooling about a cowboy's life. It is just about the hardest life there is. However, it won't be as hard for you as it is for most fellows. You can ride, though there ain't much merit in sitting on that horse of yours. Still, I see you know your way among horses, and you've taught him to come to you when you whistle, and to do pretty nigh everything you want him to. But you will find it a mighty different thing when you get on the back of a bronco. However, it is worth learning to ride a horse that has never been backed. Anyhow, I'm with you. I've had a spell at it and don't mind having another. And there is one thing, you can quit when you like." "But how about this horse? I should not like to give up Prince." "Well, you can do as you like about that. Each cowboy has 6 or 8 horses. Sometimes he has as many as a dozen, and he just ropes one out of the crowd and rides him as he has a fancy. So you could let Prince run with the rest and use him when you liked, or you could leave him at the headquarters station." "What do they want such a lot of horses for?" Hugh asked. "They want them to do the work," Bill said. "A man can go on pretty nigh forever, but a horse can't. You will find that you can use up 6 horses in the 24 hours, and they want a day to rest before they are fit for work again. Well, they will be starting on the roundup soon, so we may as well head in their direction so as to get taken on before they're full. I was working in the O Triangle Ranch 2 years ago. Their station ain't above 150 miles from where we are. The boss wasn't a bad sort. We may as well go there as to another. What do you mean by the O Triangle, Bill? That is their brand, a circle in a triangle. We call them always by their brands. They have all sorts of names of their own, but they are never known by them. There is the O Triangle and the double A and the cross T's and the diamond square and the half circles and a dozen others. Well, we'll head that way tomorrow morning. I don't know that I shall be sorry to be in a crowd again for a bit. It gets lonesome when there are only two of you after a while. Hugh was beginning to feel this also. Their subjects of conversation had long been exhausted, and after the events of the day's hunting had been discussed, there was little for them to talk about as they sat by their fire. On the evening of the third day, they arrived at the headquarters station of the ranch. It consisted of a long, low building which formed the storehouse and general room. Near it was the manager's house, and behind the barracks for the men. A short distance away was a fence which enclosed 50 or 60 acres of ground. Here were some of the more valuable of the animals, some handsome bulls and a couple of dozen good horses. 3 or 4 wagons stood near the huts, and a number of horses were grazing about over the country. The huts themselves lay in a hollow, down which a small belt of trees extended. A score of men were standing or sitting near the huts, and as many more came out as the newcomers rode up. 1 or 2 of these recognized Bill Royce. "Hello, Bill," one of them said. "Back again. I thought you had got rubbed out. Where have you been all this time?" "Been down in Mexico, and then back among the settlements. Got tired of it, and here I am. Been hunting last. This is my mate, gentlemen. He's a good sort, a Britisher, and his name is Hugh. Now you are properly introduced." "Glad to see you," the man said, holding out his hand to Hugh. "Come to pay us a visit?" "No, I have come to get work, if I can get work," Hugh said. "Oh, there's plenty of work. Well, get off your horse. He's a good 'un, he is." Such was evidently the opinion of the rest of the cowboys, for they gathered round and made remarks on Prince's points. "He is too good for this sort of work altogether, leastways for most of it, though he would do well enough for scouting round and hunting for cattle among the foothills. Where'd you get him?" "I bought him at McKinney," Hugh said. 2 fellows came along with him and wanted to sell so bad, so I got him a bargain." "I expect he didn't cost them much," the man said. "Well, it is all right as long as you don't fall across the chap he was stolen from. If you do, there will be a good many questions asked, I can tell you. I guess he came from some Mexican ranch down south. You don't often see such a bit of horseflesh about here." "Here's the boss, Hugh," Bill said. "We may as well speak to him at once," and they walked together to a man who had just come out from the manager's house. "Have you got room for 2 hands?" Bill asked. "I was here a couple of years back. My mate is new at this work, but he can ride and shoot and throw a rope." "Oh, it's you, Bill, is it? Yes, I can put you both on. I'm not quite full yet. $40 a month for you, 30 for your mate till he learns his business." "That'll suit," Bill said. "He won't be long before he gets up to the 40. "He will find it hard work at first," the manager said, "but he doesn't look as if that would hurt him." Bill and his companion now rejoined the group of cowboys, while the manager went into the store. Hugh looked with interest at the men who were to be his associates for some time. Their dress was similar to that of all the cowboys he had met while hunting. They wore hats with a very wide, straight brim, and made of a stiff felt almost as hard as a board. Most of them wore a cord of gold or silver mixed with color round it. All wore flannel shirts with a handkerchief, which in the majority of cases was of silk, round their throats. Round the waist they wore a Mexican sash of bright color. Their trousers were either of thick material or of very soft tanned leather, and over these were chaparajos, or Mexican overalls, with a colored fringe down the outside seam. A few had jackets on, and these also had tufts of colored fringe on the seams of the arms. They were most of them spare, active men, without an ounce of superfluous flesh. They were quiet in manner, with little of the reckless jollity of the ordinary frontiersman. Hugh was particularly struck with the keen, watchful expression of their eyes, the result of long nights of watching and of days spent on horseback in search of stray animals and of danger from Indians. All carried a revolver on the hip or hind pocket, had a long knife stuck in their sash, and wore high boots cut away behind at the bend of the knee, but coming several inches higher in front. Following Bill's example, Hugh unsaddled his horse. "Go off, boy," he said, giving him a pat, and Prince walked leisurely away, accompanied by his 2 companions, who always kept near to him. "We cannot offer you a drink," one of the cowboys said to Hugh. "No liquor is allowed on the ranch. It comes rather hard at first, but it is best for us all." I have touched nothing for the last 4 months but tea, Hugh said, and don't care for spirits anyway. It would be a good thing if none of us did, the other said, but one must do something when one goes down to a town. Just at this moment a bell began to ring. There's supper, the man said. There was a general movement into the large hut. Here long tables were laid out and dishes piled up with meat, and great platters of potatoes were ranged along at short intervals. Hugh was gifted with an excellent appetite, but he was astonished at the way in which the food disappeared. The meal was accompanied by a supply of very fair bread fresh from the oven and tea with milk. Ewart keeps a few cows down here, the man next to Hugh said in answer to his remark about his not having seen milk for 3 months. Of course, we don't get it at all the outstations. Who is Ewart? Hugh asked. Oh, he is boss. We don't have any misters out here. One man is as good as another. You have just arrived here at the right time. We've been driving in the horses from the ranch for the last 3 days, and tomorrow we are going to begin breaking them. Of course, a good many of them were ridden last year, but there are a lot of broncos among them. We've got a bronco breaker out here. A bronco, Hugh knew, was a horse that had never been ridden. How do you do about horses? He said. Well, 3 or 4 of those that have been ridden before are told off to each man. Then, if anyone fancies a bronco, he can take him and break him for himself. Then men can swap with each other. You see, some men ride better than others. Some men like quiet mounts. Others don't mind what they sit on. And you see, the best horses are very often the most full of tricks. You ride your horse as you like, but everyone keeps his quietest for night watches. You must have a quiet horse for that, for if your horse was to begin to play tricks, he would stampede the cattle, sure. I suppose after they have been ridden one season, they are quiet enough? Hugh said. Not a bit of it, the man replied. Some of them seem to get wickeder and wickeder. They get a bit better towards the end of the season, but 6 months running wild does away with all that. I would just as soon take my chances with a fresh broken bronco as with one that has been ridden before. They are wilder, you know, but not so cunning. An old horse seems to spend most of his time in thinking what game he shall be up to next, and when you see one walking along as if he had never done anything but walk along all his time, just look out, or you will find yourself 6 feet up in the air. Supper over, pipes were lighted, and Hugh listened with great interest to the talk going on around him. Some of the men had been on the ranch all the winter. Others had been away, some back in the settlements, others in New Mexico, where they had been either loitering away their time in the towns or working on Mexican ranches. Hugh was struck with the quiet way in which they talked, the absence of argument, and the air of attention with which each speaker was listened to. He thought he had never been among a more quiet set of men, and wondered if these could be really the cowboys of whose wild doings he had heard such tales. Gradually, one by one, they lounged off to the hut behind, and he and Bill soon went off also. It consisted of one room about 60 feet long. A stove with a huge fire burned in the middle, for the nights were cold. Down both sides and along the ends extended a double row of bunks. In the great majority of these lay blankets, showing that they were occupied. Choosing 2 empty ones, they placed the blankets and other articles they had taken from their saddles in them, put their belongings under their heads, rolled themselves up in their blankets, and were soon sound asleep. The first thing next morning, they handed over to the storekeeper the remainder of their flour, tea, and sugar. The value of these was credited to them, and they took out the amount in a couple of pairs of chaparajos, 2 cowboy hats, and 2 pairs of high boots, paying the balance in cash. Then they joined the cowboys. These were gathered in an enclosure with a very strong fence adjoining the fenced-in ground. Several cowboys rode off as they entered, and in a quarter of an hour a mob of horses was seen approaching, the men riding behind, cracking their whips and yelling at the top of their voices. The gates were opened, and a couple of minutes later the horses rushed in. There were some 40 or 50 of them, and of these about 2/3 were branded. In the first place, the others were speedily roped both by the head and hind legs. 4 cowboys hung onto the ropes while another approached with a heated brand and applied it to the animal's hindquarters, the horses kicking and struggling wildly. As soon as the operation, which lasted but a second or 2, was completed, the ropes were loosed, and the frightened animals rejoined their companions, who were huddled in the corner of the enclosure. Now, each man of number 1 and number 2 outfit take one of the horses, the manager said. Hugh and Bill had the night before been told that they were to form part of number 2 outfit. Like the others, they had their ropes in their hands, and had brought their saddles inside the enclosure. Hugh picked out a horse that struck him as being a good one, and threw his lasso round its neck. One of the cowboys belonging to the other outfit, who was standing by, said, "That is a pretty bad horse, mate. I would take a quieter one if I were you." "I have got to learn to sit them," Hugh replied, "so I may as well begin with a bad one as a good one." All right, the other said, taking hold of the rope and helping Hugh haul upon it. The animal resisted violently, but the pressure of the rope half choked him, and he was forced to leave the group and come up to them. I will hold him, Hugh's assistant said. Get your saddle and bridle. There was some difficulty in putting these on, for the animal kicked, plunged, and reared furiously, and it was only when another cowboy threw a rope and, catching one of its hind legs, pulled it out stiffly behind, that Hugh succeeded in saddling it. Now up you go, the man said. Gathering up the reins, Hugh sprang into the saddle, and the two men, as soon as they saw him seated, slipped off the ropes. For a moment the horse stood perfectly still. Keep his head up, one of the men shouted, but before Hugh could draw in the reins, the horse dropped its head to its knees. Then it seemed to Hugh that it doubled itself up, and before he knew what had happened, he felt himself flying through the air and came down to the ground with a crash. There was a shout of laughter from the cowboys, but 2 or 3 of them helped Hugh, who for a moment was almost stunned, to his feet. That is bucking, I suppose, he said as soon as he could get breath. That's bucking, sure enough, one of those who had helped him said. Well, I will try again in a minute, Hugh said. Take it quietly, the man said good-natured. You fell pretty heavy and you're shaken up a bit. You'd better hitch him onto the fence and look about you for a few minutes before you try again. Hugh thought the advice good, and after fastening up the horse stood watching the man they called the bronco breaker, who was fighting one of the most vicious of the last year's horses. Had he not seen it, Hugh would not have believed it possible that a horse could go through such performances. He had ridden many vicious brutes at home, and had thought that he knew something of horses, but this was a new experience for him. In the rearing, kicking, and plunging there was nothing novel, and as the horses were much smaller than the English hunters to which he had been accustomed, he felt that if this had been all, he should have no difficulty in keeping his seat. But the bucking was new to him. To perform it, it was necessary that the horse should be able to get its head down. The moment this was done, it sprang straight into the air, at the same time rounding its back, and this with such a sharp, sudden jerk that it fairly threw the rider into the air. On coming down, the animal kept its legs stiff, so that the jerk to the rider was scarcely less than that of the upward spring, and before he had time to settle himself in the slightest, the horse repeated the performance, varying it occasionally by springing sideways, backwards, or forwards. The breaker, or as they were generally called, the bronco buster, kept his figure perfectly upright with a tremendous grip upon the saddle with his thighs, but depending, as Hugh could see, rather upon balance than upon his hold. The exertion was evidently great. The man's hat had been jerked off, the perspiration stood upon his bronzed forehead. From time to time he dug his spurs into the animal's flanks and excited it to continue its desperate efforts, until at last the horse was utterly exhausted and stood with its head drooping, unable to make another effort. There was a shout of applause from the cowboys looking on. "Bully for you, Jake! He is a brute, that is, and no mistake." "I will give him a turn every day for a week," Jake said. "He is worth taking trouble with. I will take him for a gallop tomorrow." "Do they buck when they are galloping?" Hugh asked the cowboy next to him. The latter nodded. "Not when they are going at their best pace. They haven't time to do it then. But when they are going at hand gallop they will do it. They wait until you are off your guard, and then up they go in the air and come down perhaps 3 yards sideways, and it's 50 to 1 against your being on their back when they do come down." "I see how it is done now, though I don't see how I can do it," Hugh said. "But I will try again." The horse was led out, and Hugh again mounted. This time he was prepared for what was to come, but in spite of the grip with his legs, the blow lifted him far above the saddle. It seemed to him that the next buck came before he had fairly descended, for it struck him with the force and suddenness of an electric shock. Again and again he was thrown up until he felt his balance going, and the next jump threw him fairly over the horse's head, but as he was prepared for the fall, it was much less heavy than the first time. Well done, several of the cowboys said as he rose to his feet. "You will do, you will, and make a good rider before long. That will do for today. I would not try any more." "I am going to try it until I can sit him," Hugh said. "I have got to do it, and I may as well go on now before I get stiff." The bronco breaker came up to him as, after waiting a minute or two to get his breath, he again prepared to mount. "Don't keep your back so stiff, young fellow. Just let your back go as if there was no bones in it. I've known a man's spine broke before now by a bucker. Sit easy and listen. Keep your head. That is the principal thing. It ain't easy when you are being pitched up and down like a ball, but it all turns upon that. Let your legs close on him tight each time you come down, if only for a moment. That saves you from being thrown clean away from him." Hugh sprang onto the horse, and the struggle began again. It ended like the last, but Hugh had kept his seat somewhat longer than before. Again and again he tried, each time with more success. The fifth time he felt that the horse's action was less sudden and violent, and that it was becoming fatigued with its tremendous exertions. "Now, you brute," he muttered, "it is my turn," and he dug his spurs into the horse. A spring more violent than any he had yet felt followed the application, and for a minute or two he was almost bewildered by the force and rapidity of the animal's springs. But he was now confident that he was gaining the mastery, and the moment he found that its efforts were decreasing, he again applied the spurs. The response was less vigorous than before, and in 5 minutes the animal stood exhausted and subdued. A cheer broke from the cowboys who were standing round looking on at the struggle. "Well done, young fellow! You are the toughest tenderfoot I have ever seen," one of them said, shaking him by the hand. "I don't believe there are 10 men in the camp who would have sat that horse as you have, and you say that it is the very first time you have been on a bucker." "I have beaten him," Hugh said, "but he has pretty well beaten me. You must help me off my saddle, for I feel as if my back was broken and that I could not lift my leg over the saddle if my life depended on it." Two cowboys lifted him from his seat. "That is a hard tussle, mate," the bronco breaker said, coming up to him, "and you have stuck to it well. You are clear grit, you are. The best thing you can do is to walk about for the next hour. Just keep yourself moving. Then go and wrap yourself up in 2 or 3 blankets and lie down on your bunk for a bit. Have a thorough good sweat, and then strip and rub yourself down. Get your mate to rub your back well, and then dress and move about. The great thing is not to get stiff, but you will feel it for a day or two." Hugh followed the advice, but he found it hard work to do so. He was bruised all over with his falls. He scarce seemed able to put one leg before another, and at every moment a sharp pain shot through the loins, and he felt as if his spine had been dislocated. Still, for an hour he walked about, and at the end of that time felt that his movements were more easy. Then he went to the hut, wrapped himself in Bill's blankets and his own, and presently dozed off to sleep. A couple of hours later he woke and saw Bill standing beside him. "Now, Hugh, you'd better turn out and let me give you a rub. Just take off that shirt. I've got a lump of hog's grease here." Hugh got out of the bunk with some difficulty and took off his shirt. "Now you lean your hands on that bunk and arch your back. That's it. Now here goes." For a good half hour Bill worked at his back, kneading it with his knuckles down both sides of the spine and across the loins. "Now you will do," he said at last. "Put on a dry shirt and come out." Hugh strolled down to the stockyard. He felt wonderfully better after the rubbing, and was able to walk with far greater ease than before. The scene in the yard was unchanged. Fresh groups of horses had been driven in as fast as the others had been saddled and mounted, and by nightfall each of the cowboys had been provided with 3 horses. Hugh was greatly amused at the scene, for spills were numerous and the shouting and laughter incessant. The next day the work of breaking in the broncos commenced. One after another they were roped and dragged out of the drove. The bridle was slipped on, and they were then blindfolded while the saddle was put on and fastened. Then Jake mounted. The cloth was drawn off the animal's head, and the struggle commenced. The horses tried every means to unseat their rider, but in vain. Some submitted after comparatively short struggles. Others fought long and desperately. As soon as the first victory was won, bars were let down, and the horse was taken for a long gallop across the country, returning home subdued and trembling. Then the process was repeated with a fresh animal. "How long does he take to break them?" Hugh asked a cowboy. 3 days generally. Sometimes he will ride them 4 or 5 times, but 3 is generally enough. Then they are handed over to us to finish." "It must take a lot out of them," Hugh said. "It would be better to do it more gradually. You see they are scared nearly to death before they are begun with." "He cannot afford the time," the man said. "He gets $2 a horse for breaking them. He will be here for a fortnight, and in that time he will do pretty well 100. Then he will go off somewhere else." "It must be tremendous work for him," Hugh said. "It is that, you bet. A bronco buster seldom lasts above 2 years. They get shaken all to pieces and clean broke up by the end of that time." As fast as the horses were broken in, they were handed over to the cowboys, and Hugh, who had been unable to do any work for 2 days, then began to break in the lot that were to be his particular property. But he was fond of horses, and could not bring himself to use such violent measures as those which he saw adopted by his companions. The first lesson they taught him was to stand still the moment a rope fell over their necks. The animal was led up to the stump of a tree and then loosed. It at once went off at full speed, but as it did so, its owner threw the noose of his rope over its head, and then gave the other end a turn round the stump. The shock was tremendous, the horses being frequently jerked right over onto their backs. 2 or 3 experiences of this sort was sufficient, and the animal thenceforth learned to stand, not only when a rope was thrown round its neck, but even when the reins were dropped upon it, so that when its master dismounted it remained perfectly quiet until he again mounted and took the reins in his hand, even if he was absent a considerable time. As the teams were to start in a few days on the roundup, Hugh felt that it would be useless for him to attempt to break the horses in by English methods, and he was therefore obliged to adopt those in use by his companions. He mollified them, however, to some extent by getting another rope and tying it to his own. He then took only a half turn round the stump, and let the rope run out, at first fast, but checking it gradually until its pressure upon the neck brought the animal half suffocated to a stop. It took him longer to accomplish his object, but he found that by the end of a week the 7 horses had all learned their lessons, each having been ridden for an hour every day. He had had several severe battles with the animal he had first mounted, which was by far the most vicious of them, but the struggle each day had become less severe as the horse recognized the futility of endeavoring to unseat its master. Hugh had many falls during the schooling, but he was upon the whole well satisfied with the result. Several of the cowboys had advised him to use the methods they adopted for securing them in their seats upon specially vicious horses. One of these methods was the fastening of a loop of leather to the high pommel. Holding this in the hand, it was well nigh impossible to be bucked from the saddle, but there was the disadvantage that if the strap broke, nothing could save a rider from a fall far more violent and heavy than that which came from being pitched from the saddle in the ordinary way. Another method was to fasten a strap passed under the horse's belly tightly below each knee. But this, although it held the riders in their saddles, had the serious disadvantage that in the event of a horse rearing and falling back, or of its falling headlong from putting its foot in a hole, the rider could not free himself and was almost certain to be crushed under the horse. Others again fastened themselves by bringing their feet together and crossing their spurs under the horse's belly, a safer measure than the last, but objectionable inasmuch as the spurs, when the animal bucked, struck him in the belly and so increased the violence of his action. Of course, the best riders refrained from using any of these methods, trusting only to their leg grip and to balance, and Hugh determined to ride in this way, even if it did cost him a few more falls. He was on excellent terms with the rest of the cowboys. The tenderfoot, as a newcomer is called, is always the subject of endless pranks and annoyances if he evinces the least timidity or nervousness. But if, on the other hand, he shows that he has pluck, determination to succeed, and good temper, he is treated with kindness and cordiality. Hugh's exhibition, therefore, of courage and horsemanship on the occasion of his first attempt at once won their liking and admiration, and all were ready to lend him a hand when necessary, and to give him hints and advice, and he was free from any of the annoyances to which new hands are often exposed. There were several other tenderfeet among the party. 2 or 3 of these got on fairly and soon ceased to be butts, but the rest, before a week was up, found the work altogether too trying, and one after another went off in search of some less dangerous occupation.